Today we are going to explore a little-known universe of medieval history, the daily lives of the nuns who lived in European convents between the 12th and 13th centuries, women who renounced the world to dedicate every moment of their lives to prayer, work and spiritual pursuit. Before continuing with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this one. It is the year 1200 somewhere in Europe. Darkness still dominates the sky when the sound of a bell breaks the silence of the early morning. In a communal dormitory, dozens of women awaken from their straw mattresses. The cold penetrates their bones, but they do not hesitate. With movements rehearsed by the repetition of hundreds of identical mornings, they wrap themselves in their heavy wool habits and form a silent procession through the stone corridor. Their steps are muffled, almost inaudible, as if even walking were a form of reverence. They head to the chapel, where the flickering light of a few candles partially illuminates their concentrated faces. And then, in that freezing and semi-dark space, their voices rise in unison. Gregorian chant fills every crevice of the ancient walls, echoing as if the building itself breathed through that melody. It is the office of matins, the first prayer of the day, chanted while the rest of the world still rests under blankets. This scene, seemingly simple, contains within itself the essence of an entire existence. For medieval nuns, each day was a meticulous replica of the previous one, and every gesture, however trivial it might seem, carried the weight of a sacred purpose. But who were, after all, these women who chose a life so radically different from everything the secular world offered? To understand the daily life behind the cloister walls, it is first necessary to understand what led a young woman in medieval Europe to cross the gates of a convent, often knowing she would never cross them again in the opposite direction. In medieval European society, the options available to a woman were extraordinarily limited. The most common and expected path was marriage, arranged by the family according to political, economic, or social interests. The alternative was religious life. For some, this choice was born of an authentic vocation, a genuine spiritual calling that impelled them to seek proximity to God in an integral and exclusive way. They desired an existence dedicated entirely to contemplation and prayer, away from the complexities and temptations of the outside world. But it would be naive to suppose that all nuns entered the convent moved by mystical fervor. Many were placed there by the decision of their families. Noble families, for example, often had more daughters than advantageous marriages available. When dowries and possible alliances were exhausted, offering one of the daughters to the church was a solution that combined piety with pragmatism. The young woman entered the convent, and the family simultaneously fulfilled a religious obligation and resolved a practical dilemma. There were also those who sought the convent as a refuge, widows who desired a quiet life, women fleeing adverse situations, and noble ladies who found in the cloister a security that the outside world could no longer offer. The convent also represented one of the rare environments where women could access formal education in reading, writing, Latin, and music. Whatever the reason that led them there, once the decision was made, there was no easy return. The young woman who wished to become a nun first went through a period as a novice, a phase of learning that could last a year or more. During the novitiate, she learned the prayers, became familiar with the rules of the community, and was observed by the mistress of novices, who evaluated her vocational aptitude. If the novice persevered and was accepted, the moment of solemn profession arrived. In this ritual, the young woman pronounced the vows that would define the rest of her life: poverty, chastity, and obedience. She formally renounced any personal property, marriage, and the possibility of making independent decisions. As part of the ceremony, her hair was cut, symbolizing the renunciation of worldly vanity, and she received the habit and the veil that would identify her as a consecrated woman. From that moment on, the convent became her entire universe. The life that awaited her inside those walls was governed by a rigorous structure. Most female convents followed the rule of Saint Benedict, originally written in the 6th century for monks, but widely adopted by communities of women as well. This rule established a balance between three pillars: prayer, work, and community life, summarized in the Benedictine motto, ora et labora, pray and work. The architectural complex of a medieval convent reflected this philosophy. In the center was the chapel, the heart of the community. Around it were arranged the dormitory, the refectory, the kitchen, the storerooms, and the chapter house, usually organized around a central courtyard surrounded by covered passages, the cloister itself. Everything there was deliberately simple and functional, converging toward a single purpose, to direct the minds of the nuns toward God. And it was in this austere setting that the day of a medieval nun unfolded, marked by an immutable cadence that transformed time itself into an instrument of devotion. The backbone of her routine was the divine office, the cycle of canonical hours of prayer that punctuated the 24 hours of the day, with 8 liturgical services distributed at regular intervals. Long before dawn, when the sky was still a black mantle without stars, the nuns were awakened for the first and most solemn of these services, matins, also called vigils. This office could begin at midnight or in the early hours of the morning, depending on the tradition of the convent. The religious women gathered in the church, still shrouded in darkness, and there, under the flickering candlelight, they chanted psalms and sacred readings. It was an act of profound devotion, offering praise to God at the moment when the whole world slept. After matins, a brief service called Lauds greeted the rising sun, and then, with the arrival of daylight, the succession of canonical hours continued its inexorable course. Prime was celebrated around 6 in the morning, terce around 9, sext at noon, none around 3 in the afternoon. Each of these offices was relatively brief, consisting of a few psalms, hymns, and prayers, but together they formed an uninterrupted chain of devotion that fragmented the day into segments of work interspersed with prayer. It did not matter what a nun was doing, whether weeding the garden, sewing a garment, or copying a manuscript. When the bell rang announcing the next office, she immediately interrupted her activity and headed to the chapel. This obedience to the bell was absolute and non-negotiable. Every day the most important liturgical event was the Mass, usually celebrated in the morning. Being women, the nuns could not be ordained as priests, and therefore an external priest, usually a designated chaplain or a monk from a neighboring monastery, was summoned to celebrate the Eucharist. The religious women attended the ceremony from the other side of a grille or lattice that demarcated the enclosure, listening to the prayers in Latin and receiving communion through an opening. The Mass was the spiritual high point of the day, the moment when the sisters believed that Christ made himself truly present among them in the sacrament. At dusk, the community gathered for Vespers, singing psalms of praise and gratitude as the sun set on the horizon. And finally Compline, the last office of the day, consisted of a gentle and contemplative service in which the nuns asked for divine protection for the approaching night. After Compline, the so-called Great Silence was imposed. The convent plunged into total stillness, and not a word was uttered until the following morning. The nuns retired to their beds, and the only sound that would break that peace would be once again the bell for matins, calling them back to the chapel in the darkness of the early morning, restarting the endless cycle of prayer. In total, a medieval nun spent several hours a day in communal prayer. This tireless routine could be exhausting, especially the duty of waking up in the middle of the night, but it was understood as the sacred service par excellence. The sound of voices singing in unison in the chapel, at any hour of the day or night, was the pulse of the convent, the sign that every moment belonged to God. But convent life was not limited to prayer. Between the liturgical offices, there was a world of work that needed to be performed to keep the community functioning. Monastic tradition taught that idleness was the great enemy of the soul, and therefore, when they were not in the chapel, the nuns dedicated themselves to productive tasks ranging from the heaviest manual labor to the most refined intellectual activities. One of the most common and important occupations was textile work. The nuns spent long hours spinning wool or linen, weaving cloth, sewing and mending garments. They produced their own clothes, habits and bedding, and frequently also made the liturgical vestments used in the chapel, such as altar cloths and priestly robes. Medieval convents were particularly recognized for the quality of their embroidery. Some communities became famous for producing vestments ornamented with gold and silk threads, true works of art that combined technical skill with religious devotion. A nun could spend entire days by a window, patiently embroidering an altar frontal with images of saints. dedicating every stitch to the glorification of God. This type of delicate manual work was considered not only a productive activity, but also a form of prayer, a way to beautify the house of God and to demonstrate, through the beauty created by one's own hands, the glory of divine creation. In addition to textile work, some nuns dedicated themselves to an even rarer and more precious activity, the production of books. Certain female convents possessed libraries, and in some cases scriptoria, writing rooms similar to those in male monasteries. Literate nuns occupied part of their time with lectio divina, the sacred reading of biblical and theological texts, but they could also copy manuscripts. Although monks are generally better remembered as scribes and copyists, there is notable evidence of female participation in this activity. One of the most impressive examples is that of a 12th century German nun named Guda, who worked as a scribe and illuminator. Guda copied and decorated a homiliary, a collection of sermons, and painted a self-portrait inside an initial letter of the manuscript, accompanied by an inscription in which she identifies herself as the author of the work. Modern scholars consider this self-portrait to be one of the oldest known examples of a woman signing her own portrait in the Western manuscript tradition. Another fascinating archaeological discovery reinforces this participation. In a medieval cemetery associated with a small convent in Dalheim, Germany, researchers found tiny particles of ultramarine blue, a rare pigment produced from lapis lazuli, in the teeth of a religious woman who lived between the 11th and 12th centuries. The presence of this pigment suggests that the nun was a manuscript illuminator who, by moistening the tip of her brush with her lips, involuntarily ingested small amounts of the pigment over the years. This material evidence offers tangible proof that some nuns worked with artistic materials of the highest quality. However, not every nun was a skilled embroiderer or a talented scribe, and not all desired to be. Many dedicated themselves to more practical tasks, but equally essential for the survival of the community. In the convent kitchen, the nuns prepared meals, baked bread and brewed beer. The most common drink of the time, as water was often not safe for consumption. The alcohol content of this convent beer was considerably low, serving more as a safe form of hydration than as an intoxicating beverage. In the gardens and orchards, the religious women grew legumes, vegetables, herbs and fruits, and cared for domestic animals such as chickens, whose eggs supplemented the community's diet. They also washed and mended their simple clothes in a continuous cycle of maintenance of daily life. Within the organizational structure of the convent, various sisters were assigned specific functions. The infirmarian cared for the sick nuns in the infirmary with herbal remedies. The sacristan looked after the chapel. The almoner distributed alms to the poor at the convent gates. In larger and more prosperous convents, heavy external labor was performed by hired workers. In smaller convents, however, the religious women themselves had to perform all kinds of manual labor. Compared to monks, nuns generally performed less heavy agricultural work, and the famous Abbess Heloise in the 12th century even argued that it was unrealistic to demand from nuns the same strenuous labor imposed on monks. But regardless of the nature of the task, the fundamental principle remained the same. Every capable nun had to have her daily obligations, and all work was understood as an extension of prayer. Even activities considered recreational had a devotional purpose, such as painting sacred images or composing liturgical music. And here, it is impossible not to mention Hildegard of Bingen. Born in 1098 in the Rhine region, Hildegard was the 10th child of a noble family, and from a very young age experienced mystical visions. At the age of 8, she was sent to be educated at the Benedictine monastery of Dissy-Bodenberg. When the superior Jutta of Sponheim passed away, Hildegard was elected as the new leader of the community. Throughout her 81 years of life, she composed more than 70 sacred chants, wrote 3 large volumes of visionary theology, including the famous Civius, as well as treatises on medicine and natural history. She maintained an epistolary correspondence of nearly 400 letters with popes, emperors, and bishops. She founded 2 monasteries and undertook public preaching tours, something exceptional for a woman of her time. In 2012, she was canonized and proclaimed a Doctor of the Church. Her life demonstrates the intellectual and creative potential that convent life could cultivate, although Hildegard was undoubtedly an extraordinary exception. And this routine included aspects of daily life that, to a modern observer, might seem particularly severe. Discipline regarding food, silence, and personal comfort was rigorous and permeated every moment of the day. Silence, in particular, was a fundamental element of convent life. Most convents imposed long periods of mandatory silence, especially during the night. After Compline, the last office of the day, the Great Silence was in effect, and no nun was authorized to pronounce a single word until the following morning. But even during the day, unnecessary conversations were discouraged. To meet practical communication needs without breaking the silence, the sisters developed an ingenious system of hand signals, simple gestures that allowed them to request items like bread or water during meals without uttering a sound. This culture of silence had a dual purpose: to foster an atmosphere of interior contemplation and to avoid idle gossip, which was considered a threat to communal harmony. Meals in the refectory were modest and disciplined. Typically, the nuns had 1 or 2 meals a day, depending on the season. In the summer, when the days were longer and the work more intense, there was a main meal at noon and a light supper at dusk. In the winter, when the cold required more calories to keep the body warm, the supper could be a bit more substantial. The diet was predominantly vegetarian. The rule of Saint Benedict prohibited the consumption of the meat of 4-legged animals, except in cases of illness. Typical food consisted of bread, porridge, or thick soups of grains and vegetables, and occasionally fish or eggs as a source of protein. The usual drink was water, or more commonly, weak beer or ale brewed by the nuns themselves, as fermented drinks were considered safer than water in many regions. During periods of liturgical fasting, such as Lent or on Fridays, meals became even scarcer, often reduced to a little bread and broth. In the refectory, the nuns ate in silence, sitting side by side at long tables, while one of the sisters read a religious text aloud, offering spiritual nourishment simultaneously with physical food. Before and after each meal, prayers of thanks were chanted together. Living conditions in the cloister were Spartan, though adequate by the standards of the time. The nuns slept in a common dormitory, on straw mattresses or simple bed frames covered with wool blankets. They slept wearing their clothes or modest attire, ready to rise quickly when the bell for matins sounded in the middle of the night. A single oil lamp or candle might burn in the dormitory, providing dim lighting for orientation. In some wealthier monasteries, the dormitory was eventually divided into small wooden cubicles for each religious woman, but this practice was not the norm in the High Middle Ages. Personal space was minimal and privacy practically non-existent, sacrificed in favor of community life. Personal belongings were equally scarce. By the vow of poverty, a nun owned little or nothing as private property. Her clothing was uniform, the religious habit, made of rustic wool in a sober color. Benedictine nuns wore black habits, Cistercians used light tones, and the Poor Clares dressed in grey or brown. The attire included a tunic, a scapular, and a veil that covered the hair. Comfort was not a concern. The habit served as a constant reminder of the renunciation of luxury. Discipline was maintained under the watchful eye of the abbess. Minor infractions, such as speaking out of turn or arriving late for prayers, resulted in small penances, such as the recitation of additional prayers or the obligation to eat a meal sitting on the floor as a gesture of humiliation. Serious violations were rare, but when they occurred, they caused great scandal. If a nun seriously broke her vows or tried to flee the cloister, she faced severe punishments, which could include expulsion from the community. Records of episcopal visitations, periodic inspections conducted by bishops to verify the regularity of convent life, reveal that abbesses frequently had to admonish nuns for daily transgressions. Some kept pets such as dogs or rabbits, which was prohibited by the rule. Others formed cliques or engaged in gossip, demonstrating that even in the most devout environment, human nature found its ways of expression. But the convent was not a space devoid of joy. On liturgical feast days, the rules were slightly relaxed. The liturgy became more celebratory, the chapel was decorated with flowers, and the meal might include dishes a bit more elaborate than usual. There are accounts of communities that celebrated holy days with special enthusiasm. Hildegard of Bingen, for example, on one occasion, allowed her nuns to wear crowns of flowers in their hair and sing accompanied by stringed instruments during a saint's feast. These moments of lightness, though rare, reveal that the religious women, however austere they were, remained human beings who appreciated moments of beauty and celebration in their reclusive lives. The hierarchical structure of the convent was clear and well defined. At the top of the community was the abbess, or in smaller convents, the prioress. The abbess was the spiritual mother and administrative leader of the community, usually elected by the sisters themselves. Often coming from a noble or literate family, she held authority over almost all aspects of convent life. She supervised internal discipline, managed the finances and properties of the convent, and represented the community in negotiations with ecclesiastical authorities and secular patrons. In some regions, the abbesses of the most important convents carried a crozier, similar to that of a bishop, as a symbol of their authority. However, she was expected to govern with maternal care and humility, embodying the ideals of the monastic rule. Below the abbess, there were other religious women invested with specific functions to assist in administration. The prioress, who was the vice leader and second in command, the cellarer, responsible for managing food and provisions, the infirmarian, in charge of caring for sick sisters, the sacristan, who looked after the chapel and its vestments, and the mistress of novices, who supervised the formation of young incoming members. In small convents, the same nun might accumulate several of these functions. In larger abbeys, each position was held by an experienced and specialized religious woman. Daily life among the nuns over years and decades naturally generated deep bonds. The sisters prayed together, ate together, worked together, and shared the same spaces from waking until retiring. Older nuns took on the role of mentors for the younger ones, guiding them in spiritual life and daily challenges. Sincere friendships flourished, and there are records of religious women who, after decades of living side by side, described their bonds as stronger than blood ties. When a nun fell ill, her companions cared for her with dedication in the infirmary. When one passed away, all gathered to sing the funeral office and bury her on the convent grounds, in a mixture of mourning and trust in divine mercy. This solidarity was reinforced by the rituals of daily life, from kneeling collectively in morning prayer to the rare moments of rest shared on a Sunday afternoon. But as in any human community, there were also tensions. Misunderstandings, rivalries, and small power disputes could arise. In some convents, factions formed during elections for an abbess, temporarily dividing the community. The monastic rule and the authority of the abbess worked to smooth over these conflicts, emphasizing charity and forgiveness. In the daily chapter meeting, the nuns had the opportunity to confess small faults or express grievances, allowing problems to be addressed before they turned into long-lasting resentments. This conflict resolution mechanism reflected the practical wisdom of centuries of community life. In a closed space where the same people lived together for their entire lives, it was essential to keep channels of communication open and promote constant reconciliation. Although they lived physically separated from society, medieval nuns were not entirely isolated from the outside world. The convent maintained several carefully controlled points of contact with the reality beyond its walls. One of the most important was the regular presence of the male clergy. Since nuns could not celebrate Mass or administer the sacraments, an external priest needed to visit the convent daily or weekly. This chaplain entered the convent's orbit to celebrate the Eucharist and hear the confessions of the religious women, usually operating from behind the grille or screen that delimited the enclosure. Through him, the nuns remained connected to the wider church. The chaplain could bring news, deliver letters, and convey the sisters' questions to a bishop. Family ties also constituted a bridge to the outside world. Under strict protocols, family members could make occasional visits in a parlor separated by a metal grille. The nuns also sent and received correspondence, always with the authorization of the abbess. Nobles who had daughters in a convent often became benefactors, sending food, money, or gifts. Convents also interacted with the local community through acts of charity. The nuns could not walk the streets to help the needy, but they did what was within their reach from inside the walls. Many convents distributed food to the poor at their gates on designated days. The almoner passed bread or soup to the underprivileged who came seeking help, knowing that the nuns would not refuse them. Some religious houses, especially those linked to more active orders, maintained small infirmaries or guest houses adjacent to the cloister, where the sisters silently cared for sick or destitute women. Education was another bridge between the convent and society. Some convents functioned as schools for girls from the nobility or the nascent merchant class, instructing them in reading, writing, manual work, and Christian doctrine. Female convents provided, during this period, a standard of education for women that would not be equaled in many regions of Europe for centuries. Bishops conducted periodic visitations, and lay patrons attended Mass in the chapel or requested that the nuns pray for their intentions. The English pilgrim and mystic Marjorie Kempe, in the early 15th century, visited a community of nuns seeking advice, demonstrating that the religious women were esteemed as spiritual guides. The medieval faithful greatly valued the prayers of the nuns, considering them especially effective. Wealthy families funded convents so that the sisters would pray for their souls. When plagues, famines, or wars ravaged the region, the nuns intensified their prayers. A convent might be physically enclosed by high walls, but in the medieval mindset, it was an integral part of the community, a powerhouse of prayer and a beacon of faith. Beyond prayer and work, it is necessary to understand that convent life was not a single model. Different religious orders emphasized different aspects of monastic life. A Benedictine abbey followed the moderate rule of Saint Benedict, with a balance between prayer, work, and rest. Some better-endowed Benedictine abbeys became relatively comfortable over time, with elaborate liturgy and ornamented ceremonies. Cistercian nuns, by contrast, practiced an even more austere lifestyle, with plain churches, a meager diet, and a pronounced emphasis on silence and manual labor. The Poor Clares, founded by Saint Clare of Assisi, under the inspiration of Saint Francis, embraced radical poverty, refusing to own property and living entirely on donations. Dominican nuns, in turn, dedicated themselves to prayer and study, maintaining extensive libraries and attributing special value to intellectual engagement. There were also canonesses, who were involved in charitable works, and, outside the formal monastic system, the beguines, devout laywomen who lived in community without pronouncing perpetual vows, especially common in the Low Countries. Despite these differences in emphasis among the orders, all nuns shared the fundamental commitments of chastity, communal prayer, and withdrawal from the world. A religious woman of any order would recognize in the routine of another community the same cadence of psalms chanted at regular hours, the same cloister rituals of work and worship, and the same supreme goal of serving God with all her soul. However, despite all the piety and the rigorous structure that sustained convent life, reality was inevitably marked by challenges, human frailties, and the periodic need for reform. Not every woman who lived in the cloister had entered there by pure choice. Not all possessed a solid vocation. Some had been compelled by family circumstances, and for them, the rigid life of the convent could become an unbearable burden. There were cases, though rare, of nuns who broke their vows in ways that scandalized the church and society. The most serious episodes involved religious women who secretly left the convent to meet lovers or who became involved in illicit relationships. Ecclesiastical chronicles record some of these incidents with evident horror. Such dramatic failures were exceptional, but they served as reminders that not all inhabitants of the cloister were saints, and that human nature, with its weaknesses and desires, could eventually overcome the rigorous separation imposed by the convent walls. More frequently, problems in the convents took the form of a gradual decline in discipline or material difficulties. Some communities, especially those with modest financial endowments, fell into situations of real poverty. Nuns who had to worry about the availability of food or firewood for the winter had their spiritual attention diverted to matters of immediate survival. Conversely, other convents became too comfortable over time, relaxing the observance of silence or poverty and becoming excessively involved with local society through frequent visits or abundant correspondence. At the end of the 13th century, the Church recognized that many female religious houses needed a reinforcement of standards of conduct. In 1298, Pope Boniface VIII promulgated a decree that imposed strict enclosure on all nuns, requiring them to remain perpetually shut within their convents. This papal determination sought to curb the liberal interactions with the outside world that some communities had adopted, but its effective implementation was not always simple or immediate. However, despite occasional crises and external pressures, the institution of the female convent proved remarkably resilient over the centuries. Through wars, epidemics, and social upheavals, convents remained as centers of persistent faith and uninterrupted prayer. Many nuns achieved reputations for great sanctity, and some, such as the abbesses and mystics we know by name, produced writings that transcended the cloister walls and reached audiences throughout Europe. The personal letters of Abbess Heloise reveal a sharp intellect and profound human insight within the convent environment. The visionary treatises and musical compositions of Hildegard of Bingen earned her fame throughout Christendom. These examples demonstrate that the convent could nurture extraordinary talents alongside daily piety. Yet the overwhelming majority of nuns lived lives of silent dedication, and their names remain unknown to history. They were ordinary women who, day after day, fulfilled their obligations of prayer and work without recognition or record. They supported each other through adversities such as illness and scarcity, and shared moments of simple joy in their community life. Through it all, their faith and their sisterhood sustained them. Year after year, generation after generation, the psalms continued to be chanted in the choirs, and the lamps of the convents continued to burn. Medieval nuns lived what could be described as a continuous offering of time, work, and devotion. Every day they rose before the sun and began their prayers. Every night, silence enveloped the cloister walls, closing the day as it had begun, in the presence of the divine. Their incessant prayers were considered a spiritual safeguard for the world beyond their walls. Their labors, whether the copying of books, the cultivation of gardens, or the instruction of girls, contributed silently to the preservation of knowledge and the care of the most vulnerable. They cultivated virtues of charity, patience, and discipline, striving with very human effort to reach high ideals. There were difficulties, no doubt. Not every day lived up to the idealized standard, but the general impression that emerges from historical records is one of sincere commitment and deep conviction. For those women, there was meaning in repetition, purpose in rhythm, and sense in a community oriented toward the sacred. The greatness of their vows lay not in spectacular heroic acts, but in the faithful repetition of humble days, lived with constancy and surrender. And perhaps it is precisely this silent persistence, this devotion without spotlights and without applause, that makes the story of medieval nuns so fascinating and so deeply human. If this narrative touched you in some way, if the story of these women sparked your curiosity or offered you a new perspective on the past, consider supporting this work. Just as medieval nuns dedicated every gesture and every prayer to building something larger than themselves, every subscription, every like, and every comment you leave here contributes to keeping alive this community dedicated to telling the stories that deserve to be heard. Subscribe to the channel, share this content with those who appreciate a good historical narrative, and leave in the comments what caught your attention most on this journey through the medieval cloisters. Your participation is what allows us to continue illuminating the forgotten corridors of history, just like those candles that, night after night, burned in the darkness of the convent chapels, ensuring that the flame of knowledge would never go out.